I had always loved the ocean, the feeling of weightlessness, the vibrant colors of the coral reefs, and the strange, alien beauty of the underwater world had fascinated me since childhood. So when I heard about a series of uncharted underwater caves off the coast of a remote island, I couldn't resist the urge to explore them. The area was known for its crystal-clear waters and abundant marine life, but it was also notorious for strong currents and sudden weather changes. The thrill of the unknown called to me, and I set off on what I hoped would be the dive of a lifetime. The small charter boat I had hired was captained by a grizzled old man named Jonas. He had been diving these waters for decades and knew the area like the back of his hand. As we motored out to the dive site, he shared stories of shipwrecks, dangerous currents, and unexplained disappearances. His tales should have made me nervous, but they only fueled my excitement. We anchored a few hundred meters from the island's rocky shore. The water was a deep, inviting blue, and the sun sparkled on the surface. I suited up, checking my gear meticulously. Jonas gave me a few last-minute warnings about the caves, emphasizing the importance of not straying too far from the entrance and always keeping an eye on my air supply. With a final nod, I slipped into the water, the coolness enveloping me like a familiar embrace. I descended slowly, the sunlight filtering down in shimmering beams. The ocean floor was alive with activity. Schools of colorful fish darting in and out of coral formations, sea turtles gliding gracefully by, and the occasional reef shark patrolling the depths. I swam towards the entrance of the caves, marked by a large, jagged rock formation. The opening was wider than I had expected, and I could see a faint light coming from within. I took a deep breath, adjusted my mask, and swam inside. The cave walls were covered in a strange, phosphorescent algae that cast an eerie glow, illuminating my path. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I ventured deeper, the sense of exploration and discovery driving me forward. The cave system was a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, some barely wide enough to squeeze through. I moved cautiously, mindful of Jonas's warnings. After about 20 minutes of navigating the twisting passages, I came to a large chamber with a sandy floor and several exits. I paused to check my air supply and take in my surroundings. It was then that I noticed something odd, a strange, rhythmic thumping sound, faint but distinct. It seemed to be coming from one of the tunnels leading off the chamber. My curiosity piqued. I swam towards the sound. The tunnel was narrow and dark, the light from the algae barely penetrating the gloom. As I moved further in, the thumping grew louder, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible hum. The tunnel opened up into another chamber, this one smaller and more confined. In the center of the room was a large, ancient-looking chest, partially buried in the sand. My heart raced at the sight of it. Could it be treasure? The source of the thumping was clear now. It was coming from the chest itself. I approached cautiously, my pulse quickening. The chest was covered in barnacles and seaweed, its wood warped and discolored from centuries underwater. I reached out and brushed away some of the debris, revealing intricate carvings along the lid. The thumping continued, steady and insistent. Taking a deep breath, I tried to lift the lid. It was heavy, but it moved slightly, sand and small sea creatures spilling out from the edges. With a final heave, I managed to open it. Inside was not the treasure I had hoped for, but something far more disturbing. The chest contained a series of strange artifacts, oddly shaped stones, shards of pottery, and what looked like fragments of ancient jewelry. But the most unsettling item was a small, intricately carved idol, its eyes seemingly following me as I moved. The thumping stopped the moment I opened the chest, replaced by an eerie silence. A sudden sense of dread washed over me. I felt as if I were being watched, an oppressive weight bearing down on me. The water around me grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the chill. I knew I needed to leave, to get out of the cave and back to the safety of the open ocean. As I turned to go, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, and I kicked harder, trying to shake off whatever it was. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the light from the algae growing dimmer with each passing second. Panic set in, and I swam faster, my breaths coming in rapid, shallow gasps. Finally, I burst out into the larger chamber, my relief short-lived as I realized I had lost my sense of direction. The tunnels all looked the same, and I couldn't remember which one led back to the entrance. I checked my air supply, less than a third remaining. I had to choose quickly. I picked a tunnel at random and swam as fast as I could, the sense of dread growing stronger with each passing second. The tunnel twisted and turned, and I feared I was going in circles. Just as my air supply began to run dangerously low, I saw a faint light ahead. With renewed hope, I swam towards it, my lungs burning for air. I emerged from the tunnel into open water, the sunlight a welcome sight. I kicked upwards, breaking the surface with a gasp. Jonas was waiting on the boat, his expression one of concern as he helped me aboard. "What happened down there?" he asked, his voice a mix of worry and curiosity. I tried to explain, but the words seemed inadequate to describe the eerie experience. Jonas listened, his face growing pale as I recounted the chest, the artifacts, and the sense of being watched. "That area is known for strange occurrences," he said quietly. "Many divers have reported feeling a presence down there. Some say it's the spirits of those who perished in shipwrecks. Others believe it's something older, more malevolent." We sailed back in silence, the weight of the experience heavy on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have been left alone. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the faint thumping, echoing in my ears. The next day, I decided to do some research on the artifacts I had found. I contacted a local historian, who was intrigued by my story. When I showed him the idol, his face turned ashen. "This is a relic of an ancient cult," he explained. "They worshipped dark gods and practiced human sacrifices. The chest you found was likely an offering, meant to appease their deities. By disturbing it, you may have awakened something best left undisturbed." I left the idol with the historian, hoping that he could find a way to neutralize whatever curse it carried. I never returned to those underwater caves, and I avoided diving in that area altogether. The ocean, once a place of wonder and exploration, had become a source of fear and unease. To this day, I can still hear the faint thumping in my dreams, a reminder of the ancient terror that lurks beneath the waves. The ocean is vast and mysterious, hiding secrets that we are not meant to uncover. Sometimes, the thrill of discovery comes at a price, and the depths hold dangers that even the bravest divers should respect. I had always been a bit of a bargain hunter, often scouring Craigslist for hidden gems. My apartment was practically furnished with second-hand finds, each piece with its own story. So, when I came across an ad for a vintage armoire at an unbelievably low price, I couldn't resist. The listing was sparse, just a single grainy photo and a brief description. "Old armoire. Needs TLC. $50. Must pick up tonight." I called the number listed, and a gravelly voice answered. The man sounded eager, almost desperate, to get rid of the piece. He gave me an address on the outskirts of town and emphasized that I needed to come that evening. It was a bit odd, but I chalked it up to someone needing quick cash. After all, a vintage armoire for $50 was a steal. As the sun began to set, I loaded up my truck and set out for the address. The drive took me through increasingly rural areas, the roads narrowing and the houses growing farther apart. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road that led to an old farmhouse, its paint peeling and windows dark. The place looked abandoned, and a shiver of apprehension ran down my spine. I parked and got out, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound in the still evening. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal a gaunt man with hollow eyes. He looked much older than his voice had sounded on the phone. "Are you here for the armoire?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes," I replied. "Is it inside?" He nodded and stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. The interior of the house was dimly lit and cluttered, with dust motes dancing in the air. He led me through a narrow hallway to a room at the back of the house. There, standing against the far wall, was the armoire. It was a beautiful piece, even under the layer of dust and grime. Ornate carvings adorned the doors, and despite its obvious age, it seemed solid and well-made. I could hardly believe my luck. "It's perfect," I said, running my hand over the wood. "I'll take it." The man's expression was unreadable as he helped me move the armoire to my truck. He seemed eager to get rid of it, his hands trembling slightly as we maneuvered it through the door and onto the bed of the truck. Once it was loaded, he refused the cash I offered him. "Just take it," he said, his voice tight, "and be careful." The drive back was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's behavior had been strange. When I got home, I enlisted the help of my neighbor, Tom, to carry the armoire up to my apartment. We set it up in the living room, and I spent the next hour cleaning it up, polishing the wood until it gleamed. As I worked, I noticed something odd. The inside of the armoire was lined with old newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle with age. They seemed to cover every inch of the interior, and as I examined them, I realized they all had one thing in common. They were obituaries. A chill ran down my spine as I read the names and dates, some of them decades old. That night, I went to bed feeling uneasy, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The armoire was just a piece of furniture, albeit one with a strange history. But as I lay in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke in the middle of the night to a soft creaking sound. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to determine where it was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the living room. I got up, my hands shaking, and crept down the hall. The living room was dark, but the armoire stood out, a hulking silhouette against the wall. The doors were slightly ajar, and as I approached, they creaked open further. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the air. A faint whispering filled the room, so soft I could barely make out the words. It seemed to come from the armoire, and as I stared at it, the whispering grew louder. I reached out, intending to close the doors, but as soon as my fingers touched the wood, a jolt of icy pain shot through my arm. I jerked back, and the whispering stopped. The room was deathly silent, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I backed away, my heart racing, and fled to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. Sleep was impossible, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The next day, I decided to investigate the armoire's history. I went to the local library and searched through old records and newspapers. What I found was disturbing. The farmhouse where I had picked up the armoire had a dark past. Decades ago, it had been the site of a series of mysterious deaths. The victims, all members of the same family, had died under strange circumstances, and the case had never been solved. The armoire had been in the house for generations, passed down through the family. It was said to be cursed, bringing misfortune and death to those who owned it. The obituaries I had found lining its interior were the final clue. Each one was a member of the ill-fated family. I realized I had to get rid of the armoire, but I was afraid to simply abandon it. I didn't want to pass the curse on to someone else. I decided to return it to the farmhouse, hoping that leaving it where it belonged would break the curse. That evening, I loaded the armoire back into my truck and drove to the farmhouse. The place looked even more desolate in the fading light, and a sense of foreboding washed over me as I approached. I parked and struggled to unload the armoire by myself, dragging it back inside the house. I left it in the same room where I had found it, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. As I turned to leave, the whispering started again, louder this time, filling my ears with a cacophony of voices. I ran, the door slamming shut behind me. Driving away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I hoped that by returning the armoire, I had done enough to break the curse. But even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. The whispering still haunts my dreams, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the soft creak of the armoire's doors opening, even though it's miles away. I've stopped looking for bargains on Craigslist, and I can't bring myself to buy secondhand furniture anymore. The memory of that night and the cursed armoire is a constant reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind even the most innocent-looking objects. The sun was setting behind the rolling hills as I drove down the winding country road, my old truck bouncing on the uneven pavement. I had decided to take a long weekend and head out to a remote fishing spot I'd heard about from a fellow angler at work. He called it Whispering Lake, a secluded body of water nestled deep in the forest, far from any town or major road. According to him, the fish were plentiful and the scenery was unparalleled. I figured it was worth the drive and the effort to find some peace and quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. After what felt like hours of navigating narrow dirt roads and overgrown paths, I finally reached the entrance to the lake. The dense trees parted to reveal a small clearing with a rickety wooden dock stretching out over the still water. The lake was surrounded by thick forest, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. I parked my truck and started unloading my gear, eager to get started before the last light faded. As I set up my fishing rod and tackle box on the dock, the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the lake in a soft twilight. I cast my line and settled into my folding chair, feeling the stress of the week melt away with each gentle ripple on the water's surface. The calmness of the lake was almost hypnotic, and I found myself lost in the serene beauty of the place. About an hour later, the stars began to twinkle overhead, and the moon cast a silvery glow on the water. I had caught a couple of small fish, nothing to write home about, but I was content. The night was cool, and the air was fresh, a perfect antidote to the stale office environment I was used to. Suddenly, my rod jerked violently, almost pulling me out of my chair. I grabbed it and started reeling in, my heart pounding with excitement. This was no small fish. It felt like a monster. The fight lasted several minutes, and I could feel my muscles straining as I struggled to bring whatever it was closer to the dock. Just as I was about to catch a glimpse of my prize, the line went slack. I cursed under my breath, disappointed, but also exhilarated by the thrill. I decided to take a break and walked back to my truck to grab a drink. As I rummaged through my cooler, I heard a faint whispering sound, barely audible over the gentle lapping of the water. I paused, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Shrugging it off as the wind playing tricks on me, I grabbed a soda and returned to my chair. The whispering continued intermittently, growing louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my fishing, but it was becoming impossible to concentrate. The sound seemed to be coming from all around me, a chorus of indistinct voices murmuring just out of reach. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the trees and across the lake, but saw nothing unusual. Feeling uneasy, I decided to call it a night. I packed up my gear and headed back to the truck, the whispering following me every step of the way. As I loaded my equipment into the bed, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints leading away from the dock and into the forest. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft ground. My heart raced as I realized they weren't mine. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the footprints into the woods, my curiosity getting the better of me. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow path winding deeper into the forest. The whispering grew louder, almost as if it was guiding me. I knew I should turn back, but something compelled me to keep going. The path led me to a small clearing, where I found an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the wood rotting and the windows broken. The whispering was almost deafening now, seeming to emanate from the cabin itself. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, the smell of mold and decay filling my nostrils. The interior was in shambles, with broken furniture and debris scattered across the floor. In the center of the room was a large, circular stone with strange symbols carved into its surface. The whispering seemed to be coming from the stone, a continuous stream of unintelligible words. I felt a strange pull towards the stone, an urge to touch it. My hand reached out almost involuntarily, but as my fingers brushed the cold surface, a searing pain shot through my arm. I jerked back, the whispering turning into a cacophony of screams. The room seemed to spin, and I stumbled backwards, desperate to escape. I fled from the cabin, the screams echoing in my ears. The forest seemed to close in around me, the path back to the lake twisting and turning. I ran blindly, my flashlight flickering and threatening to go out. Finally, I burst through the trees and into the clearing, gasping for breath. I didn't waste any time loading my gear into the truck and starting the engine. The whispering had stopped, but I could still feel the presence of something watching me from the darkness. I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back until I was miles away from the lake. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I did some research and discovered that Whispering Lake had a dark history. The cabin I had stumbled upon was once owned by a recluse who was rumored to dabble in dark rituals. Locals believed the lake was cursed, and strange occurrences were not uncommon. I never returned to Whispering Lake, and I avoided fishing trips alone after dark. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint whispering, and I wonder what might have happened if I had stayed a moment longer. The clock struck midnight as I walked into the small, dimly lit security office. I had just started my shift as a night security guard at the local mall, a sprawling complex that seemed eerily deserted after hours. The bright, bustling atmosphere of the day gave way to a ghostly silence at night, broken only by the occasional hum of machinery and the distant sound of my own footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. I settled into the chair in front of the wall of monitors, each one displaying a different section of the mall. My job was simple: watch the cameras, make regular rounds, and ensure nothing unusual happened until the morning crew arrived. It was usually uneventful, a perfect opportunity to catch up on some reading or browse the internet. As the hours ticked by, I made my rounds through the darkened mall. The only light came from the dim emergency lights scattered throughout the hallways, casting long shadows that danced and flickered as I passed. I checked the doors to the stores, making sure they were securely locked, and occasionally peered into the display windows at the mannequins frozen in their eternal poses. Around 2 a.m., I returned to the security office and took a seat. The monitors showed nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual stillness of a mall after closing. I took a sip of my coffee, trying to shake off the fatigue that was beginning to set in. Suddenly, one of the monitors flickered. I leaned forward, my heart skipping a beat. It was the camera in the West Wing, near the entrance to the service corridors. The feed stabilized, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing just at the edge of the frame, partially hidden in the shadows. I squinted at the screen, trying to make out more details. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. They were standing unnaturally still, almost as if they were aware of the camera and trying to stay out of sight. I switched to the next camera, hoping to get a better view, but the figure was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Intruders weren't common, but it wasn't unheard of. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, notifying the on-call supervisor that I was going to check out a potential intruder. With my heart pounding in my chest, I made my way towards the West Wing. The corridors seemed darker than usual, and every sound was amplified in the silence. My footsteps echoed as I approached the area where I had seen the figure. I shone my flashlight into the service corridor, but there was no sign of anyone. I checked the doors and found them all locked. It didn't make sense. How could someone disappear so quickly? As I turned to head back, I heard a faint noise behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam landed on a door at the end of the corridor, slightly ajar. I knew that door led to the old and used part of the mall, a section that had been closed off for years due to renovations that never got completed. Swallowing my fear, I approached the door and pushed it open. The hinges creaked, and a musty smell hit me as I stepped inside. The air was colder here, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I followed the beam of my flashlight, my breath fogging in the chill. The old section of the mall was a maze of empty storefronts, half-finished construction, and debris. I moved cautiously, every nerve on edge. As I rounded a corner, I caught a glimpse. It was a quiet Friday night, and I found myself home alone for the weekend. My parents had gone out of town for a short vacation, leaving me to look after the house. I relished the solitude at first, enjoying the freedom to do whatever I pleased without interruptions. I spent the early evening catching up on my favorite shows, ordering takeout, and scrolling through social media. By the time I noticed the time, it was already past midnight. The house was eerily silent, the only sounds being the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I decided it was time to call it a night, so I locked all the doors and turned off the lights, leaving just a small lamp on in the living room to keep the darkness at bay. As I headed upstairs to my bedroom, a sudden noise made me stop in my tracks. It was a faint tapping sound, barely audible but persistent. My first thought was that it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the house, but when I listened more closely, it seemed to be coming from inside. I shook off the unease and continued to my room, telling myself it was nothing to worry about. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to get comfortable. The tapping had stopped, and the house was quiet again. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, a byproduct of too many horror movies and ghost stories. Just as I was starting to drift off, the tapping resumed, louder this time. My eyes snapped open, and my heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. It was coming from downstairs, near the back door. I grabbed my phone and checked the security app. The cameras showed nothing unusual, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent. My mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it was a raccoon or some other animal trying to get in. But deep down, I knew it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I debated whether to investigate or to stay safely tucked in my room. The thought of confronting whatever or whoever was making the noise sent a chill down my spine. Summoning my courage, I decided to take a look. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept down the stairs, careful to avoid making any noise. The tapping grew louder as I approached the kitchen. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every sense on high alert. When I reached the kitchen, I saw the back door was slightly ajar. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I flicked on the light and took a deep breath, stepping cautiously towards the door. I peered outside, but there was nothing there, just the empty backyard bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. I closed the door and locked it, double-checking to make sure it was secure. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard a soft thud coming from the living room. My blood ran cold. I gripped the bat tighter and moved slowly towards the sound. In the living room, I found the source of the noise. The lamp I had left on was now lying on the floor. The bulb shattered. It had been on the table when I went to bed. A wave of fear washed over me. Someone had been in the house. My instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. I didn't want to sound like a paranoid teenager, especially if it turned out to be nothing. I checked the locks on the front door and windows, making sure everything was secure. I decided to stay downstairs, too on edge to return to my room. I turned on every light and settled on the couch, bat within reach, and tried to convince myself that the worst was over. Hours passed, and I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps above me. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, trying to determine where they were coming from. The creaking floorboards seemed to echo through the quiet house, each step deliberate and heavy. I held my breath, clutching the bat tightly. The footsteps moved slowly, as if whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. They paused outside my bedroom, then continued down the hall towards the staircase. I could see the shadow of feet descending the stairs. Panicking, I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator, explaining that someone was in my house. She told me to stay on the line and remain as quiet as possible. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, slow and steady. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but minutes felt like hours as I waited. The shadow moved again, coming closer to the living room. I could see the outline of a figure just beyond the doorway. My grip tightened on the bat, ready to defend myself if necessary. Suddenly, the figure turned and bolted towards the back door. I heard the door slam open and then the sound of running footsteps fading into the distance. Moments later, the police arrived. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found no sign of the intruder. The officers took my statement and reassured me they would patrol the area throughout the night. I thanked them and tried to calm down, but the fear lingered. I stayed awake until dawn, every creak and groan of the house putting me on edge. The next day, I had the locks changed and installed additional security measures. My parents cut their trip short and returned home, worried for my safety. We never found out who the intruder was or how they managed to get inside, but the experience left a lasting impression. For months, I couldn't sleep without the lights on, and every sound made me jump. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched when I'm home alone. The memory of that night lingers in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. Driving home late at night from a visit to my parents' house, I found myself on a rural back road, the kind of road where the nearest neighbor might be miles away. It was a shortcut, one I'd taken many times before, but tonight it felt different. There was an eerie stillness to the night, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. The trees loomed over the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows that danced in the beams of my headlights. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound, and even the occasional animal rustling in the underbrush seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath. About 20 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "Turn back. It's not safe." I frowned, my mind racing. It had to be a prank. Someone from town, maybe, who knew I took this road. I shoved the phone back into the cup holder, my annoyance growing. A few miles later, the road began to narrow, the trees closing in even more. The darkness felt thicker, almost tangible. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message read, "Last warning. Turn back now." My irritation turned to unease. I pulled over, turning on the interior light and locking the doors. I typed back a quick reply, "Who is this? What do you want?" But there was no response. I took a deep breath and told myself to keep going. I had less than an hour left to drive, and the comfort of my own bed was motivation enough. As I continued, a thick fog began to roll in, reducing my visibility to just a few feet. The road twisted and turned, and I had to slow down to a crawl. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of movement. I glanced to my right, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, but when I looked again, there was nothing but shadows. The fog grew denser, and I could barely see the road ahead. I was beginning to regret my decision to continue when I noticed a dim light up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a house, a small, dilapidated structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its windows were dark, and the front door hung open on one hinge. Despite my better judgment, I decided to stop. Maybe there was someone inside who could help or at least offer some reassurance. I pulled into the overgrown driveway and turned off the engine, leaving the headlights on to cut through the fog. The silence was oppressive, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I approached the house, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight, and peered inside. The air was musty, and the interior was dark and cluttered with old furniture and debris. As I took a step inside, my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. The message was simple: "Leave, now." Panic surged through me, and I spun around, ready to bolt back to my car. But as I turned, I saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, silent and menacing. They were just shadows at first, but as they drew closer, I could make out their features. Hollow eyes, gaunt faces, and tattered clothing. I ran to my car, heart pounding, and fumbled with the keys. I managed to get the door open and jumped in, locking it behind me. The figures were closer now, their faces almost pressed against the windows. I started the engine and slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning on the loose gravel. I tore out of the driveway, the figures disappearing into the fog behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the car on the road. I drove as fast as I could, the fog gradually thinning until I was back on the main highway. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a well-lit gas station. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. When I finally looked at my phone again, there was one last message. "You were warned." The police were skeptical when I told them what had happened, chalking it up to a prank or an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had seen. For months afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I avoided that road like the plague. Years later, I heard a story about that old house, how it had once belonged to a reclusive family who had all mysteriously disappeared. Some said their spirits still haunted the area, warning away those who ventured too close. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do know this: some warnings are best heeded. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as I navigated the winding mountain road. I was driving back from a weekend camping trip, enjoying the solitude and the rhythmic swaying of the car through the curves. The radio was off, and the only sounds were the engine's low rumble and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The road was empty, save for my car, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on me, broken only by the reach of my headlights. I had just passed through the last small town a while back, and there wouldn't be another for miles. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could see it was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned suit. He stood perfectly still, staring directly at my car. Instinctively, I slowed down, unsure of what to do. There was something unsettling about him, but I couldn't just leave someone out here in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window a few inches. "Do you need help?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't move or respond. He just kept staring with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Are you okay?" I asked again, louder this time. Still no response. I glanced at the road ahead and back at the man, torn between helping and the growing unease gnawing at me. Deciding it was best to get out of there, I began to roll up the window. Just as I did, the man took a step forward. My heart skipped a beat. There was something wrong with the way he moved, jerky and unnatural, as if he hadn't walked in a long time. I slammed the car into drive and sped off, my eyes flicking nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. To my horror, the man started running after my car. At first, it seemed impossible, he was so far behind, but he was keeping up. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but no matter how fast I went, he remained in sight, his figure illuminated in the red glow of my taillights. The road twisted and turned, and I took the curves as fast as I dared, but he was relentless. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't understand how he was keeping up, how he was still there, moving with that strange mechanical gait. Suddenly, he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, the road behind me was empty. I didn't slow down, not trusting the sudden disappearance. I kept my speed up until I finally saw the distant lights of a gas station ahead. I pulled in, breathing hard, and parked under the bright lights. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. The gas station was empty, and I felt a little safer under the fluorescent glow. I decided to go inside, get a coffee, and maybe call someone. As I reached for my phone, I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. He was standing there, right behind my car, his eyes locked onto mine through the mirror. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Slowly, I turned to look out the back window, but the space was empty. My breath caught in my throat, and I whipped back around to the mirror. He was gone. Shaking, I grabbed my keys and ran inside the gas station. The attendant gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I stayed inside until I was sure the sun was starting to rise. Only then did I gather the courage to drive away, my eyes constantly scanning the road, the mirrors, the shadows. I didn't see him again, but that night has haunted me ever since. I still don't know who or what he was, but I've never driven that road alone at night again. The night was as black as ink, the moon obscured by thick clouds. As I drove down the lonely stretch of highway, my car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the desolate road ahead. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home after a long business trip, and the monotony of the drive had started to lull me into a false sense of security. The only sound was the steady hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. Suddenly, in my rearview mirror, I noticed a pair of headlights in the distance. At first, I paid them no mind. It wasn't unusual to encounter other drivers even at this late hour. However, as the minutes ticked by, I realized the headlights were getting closer at an alarming rate. The car behind me was moving fast, much faster than was safe on this winding, unlit road. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as the vehicle approached. Within moments, the car was tailing me, its high beams glaring into my mirror and reflecting harshly into my eyes. I tried to ignore it, hoping the driver would pass and continue on their way. But instead of overtaking, the car stayed glued to my bumper, swerving slightly as if to keep me in its sights. Anxiety began to creep into my chest. What did this person want? I tapped the brake lightly, signaling for the car to pass, but it only drew closer, the engine roaring aggressively. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't just a careless driver. Someone was deliberately trying to intimidate me. I considered my options. There were no exits for miles, and pulling over felt like a trap. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely alone with no way to call for help. As I sped up, the car behind me matched my pace. Every time I thought I might gain some distance, the other driver would accelerate, closing the gap again. I could almost see the silhouette of the driver, dark and menacing, through the glaring lights. My mind raced. I had heard stories of highway robberies and worse. I needed to think fast. I remembered a small side road up ahead, barely noticeable, but one I had taken on a previous trip. It was risky, but it might be my only chance. I slowed slightly, trying not to tip off my pursuer, then at the last second veered sharply onto the hidden road. The sudden turn threw me against the door, but I held the wheel steady. Gravel crunched under my tires as I sped down the narrow path, branches scraping against the sides of my car. I risked a glance in the mirror. To my relief, the other car had overshot the turn and was now frantically trying to reverse. I pressed on, the path twisting and turning, the sounds of the other car fading behind me. After what felt like an eternity, the road finally opened up to a familiar route that would take me back to the main highway. I slowed, allowing myself a moment to breathe. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. As I rejoined the main road, I kept a wary eye on the mirror, but there were no more headlights following me. The fear slowly began to subside, replaced by a deep sense of relief. I knew I would be on edge for the rest of the drive, but for now I was safe. I took a deep breath and focused on the road ahead, the distant glow of the city lights promising safety and the end of a night I would never forget. The night at Cedar Lake. It was the start of summer, and I decided to spend a weekend alone at Cedar Lake. Tucked away in the forest, the lake was a secluded spot where I hoped to unwind, fish, and enjoy the peace away from the city. I packed my gear, tent, fishing rods, and enough food to last a few days, and set off early Friday morning. The drive took about 3 hours. As the road narrowed and the trees thickened, I could feel the stresses of urban life slipping away. By noon, I arrived at the campsite, a clearing beside the lake surrounded by dense woods. I set up my tent close to the water, eager to cast my line and relax. The first day was idyllic. The sun sparkled on the lake's surface, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional splash as a fish jumped. I spent the afternoon fishing, catching a few bass which I grilled for dinner. As the sun set, the sky turned a deep orange, reflecting off the water. It was the perfect end to a peaceful day. Darkness fell quickly in the forest. The only light came from my campfire, casting flickering shadows among the trees. I sat by the fire, sipping on a beer and listening to the night sounds. Crickets chirped, and frogs croaked from the lake. The tranquility was mesmerizing, and I soon felt drowsy. I decided to turn in early, wanting to be up at dawn for more fishing. I had just settled into my sleeping bag when I heard a faint rustling outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer, but then I noticed something strange. The rustling was rhythmic, almost like footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came closer, stopping just outside my tent. Heart pounding, I sat up and grabbed my flashlight. I clicked it on, casting a beam of light around the tent. The rustling stopped abruptly. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. I unzipped the tent cautiously and peered outside. The fire had died down, leaving the area in near darkness. I saw nothing unusual. Convincing myself it was just an animal, I settled back down, though sleep didn't come easily. Every noise seemed amplified in the silence. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my anxiety, and I drifted off. I woke up just before dawn. The fire was out, and the early morning light was beginning to filter through the trees. I stepped outside, feeling a chill despite the summer air. As I walked towards the lake, something on the ground caught my eye. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the edge of the forest to my tent and then back into the woods. My heart raced as I inspected them. They were clear and unmistakable. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. A surge of fear gripped me, and I quickly packed up my gear, constantly glancing around, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. By the time I finished, the sun was fully up, but the sense of being watched lingered. I decided to stay one more night, hoping the daylight would dispel my fears. I spent the day fishing, trying to keep my mind off the footprints. But as evening approached, the unease returned. I made a bigger fire this time, hoping the light would deter any visitors. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife close by, determined to stay awake. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The fire crackled, and I began to relax, convincing myself that the footprints had been a trick of the light or my imagination. Just as I was about to nod off, I heard it again, the same rustling sound, now accompanied by a faint scraping. I froze, every muscle tensed. The noise grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the tent. I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate. I held the knife tightly, ready to defend myself. Then suddenly the noises stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. I waited, straining to hear any movement. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to unzip the tent. I shone the flashlight outside, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The ground around the tent was undisturbed. I stepped out, knife in hand, and circled the camp. No sign of anyone. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up and left Cedar Lake, casting one last glance at the still, eerie water. Back in the city, the memory of those nights lingered. I never returned to Cedar Lake, and whenever I hear the rustling of leaves, my heart races, remembering the unseen presence that watched me in the dark. I had always been drawn to the sea. My father was a sailor, and his stories of the ocean's vastness and mystery fascinated me as a child. When I turned 30, I decided to take a solo voyage across the Atlantic in his old sailboat, the Silent Waters. It was a modest vessel, built for endurance rather than speed, but it was sturdy and reliable. I spent weeks preparing, stocking up on supplies and ensuring the boat was seaworthy. The journey started off smoothly. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and gentle winds. I spent my days navigating, adjusting sails, and enjoying the solitude. The ocean was a serene expanse, stretching endlessly in all directions. At night, the stars were a blanket of glittering lights, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. On the 5th day, the weather began to change. Clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up. I secured everything on deck and prepared for a rough night. As the storm rolled in, the waves grew larger, tossing the boat around like a toy. I fought to keep the Silent Waters on course, drenched and exhausted. The storm raged for hours, but finally, it passed, leaving a heavy mist in its wake. I was exhausted, but the calm after the storm was eerie. Visibility was poor, and the only sound was the dripping of water from the sails. I decided to take a break and went below deck to rest. I awoke to a strange silence. The boat was still, as if suspended in time. I climbed back on deck and found the mist had thickened, enveloping the boat in a dense, white shroud. The compass spun uselessly, unable to find its bearing. I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from an unshakable sense of unease. As I tried to get my bearings, I heard a faint sound, a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the hull from the outside. I froze, listening intently. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. I walked around the deck, peering into the mist, but saw nothing. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps debris from the storm was caught against the hull, or maybe it was just the boat settling after the rough seas. But deep down, I felt an inexplicable dread. The mist seemed to close in, making the boat feel smaller, more isolated. I spent the next few hours trying to navigate out of the mist, but it was futile. The Silent Waters drifted aimlessly, and the tapping sound returned intermittently, always just on the edge of hearing. By evening, the mist showed no sign of lifting. I decided to anchor and wait it out, hoping it would clear by morning. As night fell, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The mist seemed to absorb sound, muting everything. I sat in the cabin, the lantern casting flickering shadows, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The tapping began again, louder this time, echoing through the hull. I grabbed a flashlight and went back on deck, determined to find the source. The mist was so thick I could barely see my own hands. I walked around the boat, shining the light into the white void, but saw nothing. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, almost inaudible whispering. My heart pounded as I scanned the water, but it was empty, save for the thick fog. Suddenly, the boat lurched, as if something had bumped it from below. I stumbled, clutching the rail. Fear gripped me as the tapping grew more frantic, echoing through the hull. The whispers grew louder, unintelligible but insistent. It felt as if the sea itself was alive, and it wanted me to leave. I raced below deck, slamming the hatch shut. The sounds were muffled but persistent. I grabbed my father's old journal, hoping for some comfort. As I flipped through the pages, I found a passage about a similar experience he had encountered. He wrote about a mysterious fog and strange noises, describing it as the sea's call. He believed it was a warning, a sign to turn back. The night seemed endless. I sat in the cabin, clutching the journal, as the tapping and whispers surrounded the boat. Every creak of the hull made me jump. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out of the mist. At first light, I went back on deck. The fog was still dense, but there was a faint glow on the horizon. I hoisted the sails and set a course, hoping to find clearer waters. The tapping and whispers faded as the boat moved, and slowly, the mist began to lift. After what felt like an eternity, the fog finally broke, revealing the open sea. The sun was a welcome sight, and the oppressive silence was replaced by the familiar sounds of waves and wind. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The rest of the journey was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of what I had experienced. The sea, vast and mysterious, had shown me a side I had never known. When I finally reached the shore, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. I sold the silent waters soon after, unable to face the memories it held. To this day, I can't explain what happened in the mist, but whenever I hear the gentle lapping of waves, I'm reminded of that night and the mysterious, unsettling presence that lurks in the depths of the ocean.